Chapter 11, The Battle of Midway and Beyond, April to June 1942. With the focus in the early years of World War II on Europe and North Africa, Adolf Hitler's actions had been the main driving force, while the Allies fought to resist the Nazi advance across the continents. However, as 1942 progressed, the Second World War was taking on global proportions, with the ramifications of the surprise Japanese attack on the American Navy at Pearl Harbour in December 1941 becoming increasingly evident. Events in the Pacific theatre of war were escalating as the Empire of the Rising Sun extended its reach further south, expanding its defensive perimeter towards Australia and to the northeast, began venturing dangerously close to the western coast of America. The seemingly unstoppable force of Japanese expansionism was nevertheless about to face a serious challenge, and as we look a little more closely at the months of April to June 1942, you'll discover that the Japanese didn't have things their own way for long. A sleeping giant had truly been awakened at Pearl, and as the Americans fully entered the arena of war, they quickly began to make their presence felt. From the daring American Doolittle raids on Tokyo through to the Battle of the Coral Sea and the dramatic events at Midway, any advantages gained by Japan at Pearl Harbour were about to be countered in some style by US forces as the tide of the war in the Pacific slowly but surely began to turn. The creation of an East Asian co-prosperity sphere, free from the shackles of the Western empires, had long been the desire of those ruling Japan. By April 1942, it seemed that the Empire of the Rising Sun was vaster than it had ever been before. The war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific had been highly successful, and the Japanese were now in control of the most strategically important parts of the Chinese coast and had occupied Malaya, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, and most of Burma. In the Pacific, they held Wake Island, New Britain, the Gilbert Islands, and Guam, and while the drive to seize new territory continued, the outlook was grim for the Allies. In the first few months of the war with Japan, valuable British and American outposts had swiftly fallen to the invading forces, and thousands of people were now prisoners of war, helplessly caught behind enemy lines. Even Singapore, once regarded an impregnable British force, had been crushed by the Japanese, dealing a devastating blow to Allied commanders. America, in the meantime, had lost valuable military bases and would soon lose its foothold in the precious Philippine Islands. After invading the capital, Manila, the Japanese were now advancing further south, hot on the heels of the retreating Allied troops, and there seemed to be little in the way of halting Japan's drive to completely dominate the Pacific. With a string of victories to boast of, many of the Japanese troops were in fact so satisfied with what they'd accomplished so far that in some regions of the new empire they took time out to relax. For the time being, the Western threat to their Pacific domain seemed to have been eliminated, and the Japanese were confident that they could hold their newly won territories with ease. Britain and America were, however, preparing to strike back, and would not take such belligerence without some form of retaliation. Days after the attack on Pearl, the British Prime Minister had rushed to Washington to begin discussions with President Roosevelt, and on December 26, 1941, in a speech before the US Congress, he stated his unwavering determination to crush the new Eastern enemy. Britain had been alone in its fight against the Axis since the fall of France in the summer of 1940, and the entry of America into the global conflict had been met with great relief by Churchill. Now Roosevelt, Churchill, and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who'd been fighting the Nazi forces since June 1941, were united against the Axis, and there was at last real hope that the Allies could win the war. As commanders were allocated to the Pacific theatre of war, however, there was no doubt that the challenges that lay ahead were great. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had assumed command of the Pacific Fleet 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on the American naval base in Hawaii, and with many battleships and destroyers sunk during the raid, he was well aware it would take time to salvage the ruins and reinstate the US fleet to its former glory. Faith
Sample complete. Ready to continue?